Jon Snow stood upon the windswept battlements of Winterfell, his dark cloak snapping in the chill breeze that smelled of snow and pine. Moonlight bathed the ancient stones, lending them a milky, ghostly hue. Silence rested upon the courtyard below, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant raven, as though the castle itself slept, gathering its strength for a new dawn. Jon had been the king in the north before, a role he had never dreamed of undertaking, and had since surrendered it in the hopes of securing peace and forging alliances. Yet now every breath he took reminded him that his destiny was bound to the north, bound more tightly than the forging of Valyrian steel. He reflected on the path that had led him here. The son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, although for most of his life he had believed himself Ned Stark's bastard. The knowledge of his parentage had brought him into conflicts that were larger than life and death, beyond the petty games of Westeros. And yet, even after the wars and the battles, he had returned to Winterfell. He had never been able to sever the ties that bound him to this place, never able to relinquish the echo in his heart that told him he was a Stark, no matter the Targaryen blood in his veins. He did not know if the North would ever truly accept him. But acceptance was a fleeting thing in a land as merciless as the North. The North was built on loyalty, on living and dying with one's kin. And if there was any soul he trusted, any person who could unite his sense of belonging with duty, it was Sansa Stark. He drew a deep breath, letting the cold air burn in his lungs. Their marriage had not been wholly free of whispers or controversy. Some said they were too close, in blood and in bonds, to wed one another. Others believed it an inevitable forging of two lines that would strengthen the North immeasurably. For so long, the northern houses had been battered by the War of the Five Kings, by the plague of the White Walkers, by the endless manipulations of lords and ladies from the south. Winterfell had nearly fallen, both physically and spiritually. But Jon and Sansa had survived. The North had survived. Now, those who questioned their union did so quietly, mindful of the fierce loyalty many had for House Stark and for the man who had led the fight against the undead. And to see them side by side, the last vestiges of the Stark line in leadership, was to see the North reborn. Their vows had been exchanged under the old gods, beneath the gnarled heart tree in Winterfell's Godwood, a place saturated with the memories of the ancient. The wedding was quiet, some would say subdued, yet many among the nobles of the North had attended. Bran, all-seeing and all-knowing in his quiet way, had blessed their union. Arya, standing with a subtle, private pride, had observed from the sidelines. Her watchful gray eyes held an emotion too complex to name. Perhaps relief, perhaps hope, perhaps something else that was uniquely hers. The lords and ladies, the bannermen and knights, had gathered under the canopy of crimson leaves. Though a stark wind whipped around them, they had stood resolute. It was not a wedding mired in pomp and extravagance, rather, it was a solemn oath that resonated through the North. Their promises fused with the unspoken will of the old gods. A new chapter was beginning. That first night, when the feast was done and the guests had retired, Jon and Sansa had walked together through the quiet corridors of Winterfell. The torches cast dancing lights upon the walls, flickering like shadows of the past, ghosts of Ned Stark, Catelyn Stark, Robb, and all those who had walked those halls before. Jon recalled how uneasy he had always felt in the presence of lords and ladies, especially during ceremonies that demanded attention and pomp. But with Sansa on his arm, looking up at him with that measured calm, her copper hair glowing and her eyes a deep, resolute blue, he felt steadied. They were a far cry from what they had been as children, back when Sansa dreamed of knights and balls, and Jon lived in the background of the Stark household, always overshadowed by the question of his parentage. Yet they had become partners, forging a bond as unbreakable as steel in the face of adversity. He remembered, too, how tender Sansa's voice had been when they were alone. She had spoken of the hardships she had endured, and he had shared his own travails. Their stories interwove, the memories of battles and betrayals, of triumphs and sorrows, each confession forging a link between them that could not be easily broken. From that night onward, their union was one of mutual purpose, to preserve House Stark, to protect the North, to ensure that those who had survived the wars would know peace at last. In the days that followed, neither could ignore the new equilibrium that settled upon Winterfell. The castle felt almost alive with optimism. Courtiers nodded more cheerfully, soldiers drilled with sharpened purpose, blacksmiths hammered away with renewed vigor. The presence of Jon Snow and Sansa Stark united, not just in blood but in matrimony, heralded a new era. They began to hold court together, listening to the petitions of small folk and lords. Jon, mindful of his experiences with the Night's Watch and the Free Folk, carried a perspective that was broader than most in Winterfell's history. Sansa, in turn, had learned cunning and diplomacy from her time in King's Landing and from the cruelty of men like Joffrey and Ramsay. She knew how to handle noble houses, how to maneuver through politics that could otherwise snare them in manipulations. Together, they made decisions, forging pacts that served the needs of the North. Many argued in hushed tones that a new golden age might be dawning. Yet the North is not a land that easily forgives or forgets. Whispers carried through corridors. Some lords questioned the appropriateness of such a union, referencing Ned Stark's piety and the vow that had once made Jon a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. While that vow had been annulled under extraordinary circumstances, the fight against the White Walkers and his subsequent death and resurrection, some bristled at the defiance of tradition. Others, however, recognized necessity. The direwolf sigil of House Stark needed to stand strong, and few could argue with the results. Fields that had once been desolate were now cultivated, thanks to the alliances forged. Crops were growing, trade from the south was carefully reopened, and winter itself seemed gentler with the menace of the others gone. Sansa's unwavering composure and Jon's unshakable sense of duty formed the steel core of leadership that resonated with their people. But calm could be deceptive. The North had its own way of testing those who claimed to lead it. Word reached Winterfell of unrest in the mountainous regions near the Vale and of political shifts in King's Landing, where a new monarch tried to hold together the pieces of a war-torn nation. Though the Iron Throne beckoned, it was not something Jon desired. He had never lusted for power, never sought glory. He had knelt when he believed it was right, fought when he had no choice, and retreated when victory turned to ashes. Now, all he desired was to keep Winterfell safe, to ensure the survival of his people, and to stand by Sansa's side as they navigated a precarious new era. Sansa proved to be an astute leader in her own right. She convened councils to address the lingering effects of war, to restore order in the smaller towns, to ensure roads were made safe for merchants. She engaged with the noble houses in a language they understood: diplomacy, courtesy, measured alliances. Meanwhile, Jon's presence intimidated potential threats, for his reputation as the slayer of the Night King, the resurrected warrior, still preceded him. When he rose to speak, lords listened. When he called for unity, men were inclined to obey, remembering how he led them beyond the wall, how he brokered peace with the free folk, how he stood at the Battle of the Bastards and defied Ramsay Bolton. Their marriage was not just an alliance for political gain, it was a convergence of hearts forged by adversity. In quiet moments, away from the public eye, Sansa would confide her fears. The memory of her captivity at the hands of the Boltons, her heartbreak and disillusionment, the suffocating threat of what might lurk in the shadows. Jon, in turn, carried the weight of his own resurrections, literal and metaphorical, and the knowledge that he did not quite belong in the world of kings and queens. Though their burdens were distinct, they found solace in the fact that they could finally share them with one another, face the old ghosts together, and emerge stronger. And so the days lengthened into weeks, then months, and the new couple found themselves deeply entrenched in the governance of the North. Their leadership bore fruit. A sense of guarded contentment began to bloom in Winterfell and beyond. The small folks' huts, once battered by raiders and snows, started to see repairs. The halls of the castle echoed with lively conversation rather than the hush of fear. The North's nobility, houses Manderly, Glover, Serwyn, Umber, rallied in earnest to pledge themselves to this new era. They felt that House Stark was truly at the helm again. Gone were the days of chaos, and with them, a sense of hopelessness that had haunted the North ever since Ned Stark's execution and the subsequent tragedies. On a certain bright morning, bright by northern standards, for the sun only half lurked behind thin, wintry clouds, Jon entered the solar where Sansa was reviewing accounts of grain and steel shipments. Her hair, pinned in a practical arrangement, gleamed in the muted light. She glanced up at him, and in the small curve of her lips, he saw her warmth, the reflection of a new bond they now shared. "We have visitors," Jon said quietly, noticing the hint of curiosity in her eyes. Sansa set aside the ledger. "Who?" "Ser Balman Birchwood from the Rills," Jon replied, crossing the room in a few brisk steps. "He's accompanied by a man from the south, a merchant of some sort. They claim they have news that concerns us." Sansa arched an eyebrow. The Rills were known for their rocky coasts and hardy folk, but it was unusual for them to send an envoy unannounced. "Shall we see what they have to say?" Jon nodded, slipping into a seat across from Sansa, a small table between them. He reached for a cup of warmed cider that sat untouched. "We should, but carefully. News from the south seldom bodes well." Not long after, Their visitors were ushered into the solar. The merchant was a stout man with a face reddened by wind and ale. Ser Balman was older, his hair a patchy gray, his posture firm. He bowed awkwardly, though not without respect. "My lord, my lady," he said, voice trembling slightly with nerves. "We've come to speak of bandit raids along the eastern roads. Several caravans have been attacked." Sansa was immediately attentive. "We have heard only rumors. Rumors that we dismissed," Jon added, leaning forward. "But if there is truth to them, we must act." The merchant shuffled forward. "These aren't mere bandits, my lord, my lady. They're organized, wearing black leathers. Some say they're sellswords who've deserted from the Vale's war. They fight in small, quick bands, vanishing into the forests." Sansa and Jon exchanged glances. Troublesome though it was, this situation was not unexpected. With every war, some men find themselves displaced, turning to violence when all else fails. The North was large and corners of it remote. Policing every path was no small feat. "Have they harmed civilians?" Sansa asked. Ser Balman nodded grimly. "Yes, my lady. Women and children among them. They spare few." A heavy silence filled the solar. Jon felt the weight of leadership bearing down upon him. It was one thing to rule from within Winterfell's great halls, to pass decrees and muster alliances, but quite another to see the fruit of their rule undone by brigands and murderers. In that moment he felt an icy anger slip through him. He remembered how hard home had looked, how innocent people had perished because help hadn't reached them in time, or because evil had moved too swiftly. Here he swore that would not happen again. "We'll assemble a band of soldiers," he said at last. "One of us should go. If these men are on the run from the Vale, we can coordinate with the Knights of the Vale, but we need to address it swiftly." Sansa inclined her head. "We cannot let them plant fear among our people, Jon. Our peace is fragile. If small folk believe we cannot keep the roads safe, they will lose faith in Winterfell." Jon agreed, though a part of him hesitated to leave Sansa behind. Still, the demands of leadership were clear. He glanced at Ser Balman. "I'll personally lead a contingent. We'll see these bandits dealt with." Sansa's eyes narrowed, not in disapproval but in concern. "You'll take enough men, won't you? Don't underestimate them." Jon placed a hand lightly over hers. "I won't. We know these roads and we've weathered worse. We'll find them." There was no question about Sansa coming along. It would be an unnecessary risk, and her presence in Winterfell was vital to keep the region stable while Jon led the search. To leave the seat of power unguarded would be foolish, and they both recognized their responsibilities. With a final nod, they dismissed Ser Balman and the merchant, promising action. The following dawn, Jon departed Winterfell at the head of a regiment of soldiers, men loyal and proven in battle. Among them were free folk who had bent the knee to him long ago, finding in Jon a man who judged them fairly. Their presence was a testament to the North's new unity. As they rode out of the gates, the sky a dim gray above, Sansa stood on the ramparts. She watched until they were but dots on the horizon. Though her face was as composed as ever, inside she felt the old pangs of anxiety. Memories of separation, of the men she cared for riding off to war, uncertain if she would see them return. But times had changed, she reminded herself. Jon was not her father, nor her brother, and the realm was not descending into the chaos it once had. Moreover, Jon knew how to survive. She forced herself to find solace in that truth. Days turned into weeks as Jon and his men scoured the eastern roads. Their first encounters with the bandits were sporadic. Glimpses of a group of shadowy figures slipping among tall pines, footprints leading to rocky inclines but disappearing in the undergrowth. They heard tales from terrified peasants describing raids that came in the dead of night, leaving the ground soaked in blood. Farms burnt to ash, livestock slaughtered. The cruelty smacked of desperation, yet it was orchestrated with the cunning of men used to war. Jon gleaned from the survivors' stories that the bandits were indeed survivors of conflict, possibly ex-sellswords turned brigands. Driven by hunger, greed, or the sheer lust for violence, they haunted the roads that connected the rills to Winterfell. In the midst of tracking them, Jon recalled lessons learned beyond the wall. Warfare in the north demanded sharp wits and knowledge of the terrain. Sometimes it was better to let the enemy come to you. So, they set traps. They waited in concealed positions along roads known to be heavily trafficked by merchants. Through forced patience, they caught the first small group of bandits trying to ambush a lone cart carrying grain. Jon's men sprang the trap, emerging from behind boulders and bushes. Steel clashed in the hush of the forest. The brigands fought viciously, but Jon's soldiers had them cornered. Soon enough, the bandits were subdued. Some, injured and defiant, spat curses at them. Others died with swords in their hands, refusing quarter. Word of the victory spread, though it was but a skirmish. Jon interrogated the few survivors. In a tense exchange by the smoldering remains of a campfire, he learned that their leader was a man called Stone, a bastard from the Vale with a vicious reputation. Legend had it he once served under a ruthless lord who had sided with one faction or another in the scramble for the Iron Throne, only to be cast aside when the tides turned. Betrayed by the people he fought for, Stone had banded together with other outcasts. They harbored a deep hatred for anyone in power. A fragile sense of empathy flickered in Jon. He knew too well what it felt like to be abandoned, to be labeled a bastard, to fight for a cause only to be let down. But empathy alone could not justify the slaughter of innocents. Jon steeled himself, resolved to do what must be done. He had the captured men put in chains to be taken back to Winterfell for trial. Their testimony would help shape the punishment and the public understanding of the threat. If they could locate Stone, they might cut the head off the snake, as it were, and put an end to these raids. Meanwhile, in Winterfell, Sansa read letters by candlelight, each report detailing Jon's progress. She felt relief at hearing of his successes, but also a gnawing worry that conflict might escalate. She busied herself with ensuring that caravans from the south were diverted temporarily away from the most dangerous roads. She dispatched ravens to their allies, forging a loose net of information around the rogue bandits. She spoke with the small council daily, forging new trade deals, urging the lords to remain vigilant, reassuring them that Jon was handling the threat. Some of the lords tried to sow doubt. Perhaps it would be better to hire their own sellswords, or to seek outside alliances. But Sansa, with quiet grace, reinforced her trust in Jon's leadership. The Lord and Lady of Winterfell were united, and that unity was what strengthened the North. She would let no one forget it. When finally Jon and his men located the heart of Stone's group, it was a gray morning near the ruins of an old keep that once belonged to a lesser house. Trees had grown up around crumbling walls, nature slowly swallowing the vestiges of a once proud estate. Smoke rose from within, a sign that the brigands felt secure enough to light fires. Jon mustered his men on the outskirts, strategizing. If Stone was inside with his core fighters, a direct assault might be bloody. Instead, Jon opted for stealth. They waited until nightfall, creeping up under cover of darkness. Thanks to Ghost, Jon's loyal direwolf, who had shadowed him since he was a boy, they discovered the watch positions and managed to take out several sentries without raising an alarm. Then came the moment of violence, swift and brutal. Jon led the charge himself. His sword, Long Claw, was a silver arc beneath the moonlight, a half-forgotten remainder of House Mormont's legacy. His men roared behind him, crashing into the brigand camp. Tents were toppled, fires kicked aside, sparks flying like lightning bugs in the night. The brigands scrambled, trying to mount a defense, but faced with overwhelming force and the element of surprise, they began to crumble. It was a savage clash nonetheless. The ring of steel on steel reverberated through the ruins, and men screamed in desperation or pain. In the chaos, Jon found himself face to face with a tall figure wielding a greatsword. The man was lean with cords of muscle visible even in the half-gloom. His face contorted in a snarl. "Stone, I presume?" Jon spat, gripping Longclaw in both hands. "Another bastard," Stone sneered, his eyes reflecting torchlight. "They said you were the king in the north once. What are you now? A dog on a leash for lords and ladies?" Jon felt a flicker of anger. "I serve the N. Orth," he said, voice low, measured. "You serve them who cast you aside." Stone's voice was thick with venom. "That's what they do, bastard, use you, then throw you away. We've found our freedom here." Jon's grip tightened. "Your freedom is built on murder and fear." Stone bared his teeth in a grin. "We do what we must. And with that he lunged. The clash was immediate. Stone's great sword crashed down with deadly force, meeting Longclaw in a shower of sparks. Jon, remembering the strength of wights and the ferocity of wildling raiders, braced himself, letting the man's momentum drive him back a step before he twisted, slashing for Stone's midsection. Stone blocked, twisting as well. A savage dance ensued, footfalls crunching over broken stones, the night air hissing with each swing. All around them, men grappled and died, but in Jon's vision, only his opponent existed. Twice Stone nearly struck home, once glancing off Jon's pauldron and once slashing across the leather of Jon's upper arm. Blood blossomed in a searing line, but Jon gritted his teeth. He recalled the training he had received under Ser Alliser Thorne's cruel watch, the practice he had had beyond the wall, the lessons of real war that shaped a fighter far beyond the formal instruction in courtyard drills. He pressed Stone back, blow by blow, until finally Stone stumbled over a broken pillar. In that breath of opportunity, Jon raised Longclaw high and brought it down in a decisive arc. Stone raised his sword to parry, but the sheer force of Jon's strike bashed his defense aside. The Valyrian steel bit deep, cutting through Stone's shoulder. The man cried out a guttural, choking sound. He fell to one knee, blood pooling at his side. Jon stopped, panting, his chest heaving. He eyed the dying man. Stone's face contorted with pain. "Finish me, bastard," he said, spitting red-stained saliva. "You can stand trial," Jon said, voice raw with the memory of how many men he had executed, how many times he had tried to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Stone laughed bitterly, blood bubbling at his lips. "A trial in the north. My fate's the same, no matter how sweet your words. Best to die with a blade in hand." Jon looked around. There was no mercy to be found in this night. No illusions that Stone could be rehabilitated. He had orchestrated raids, killed innocents, refused any path but violence. Jon understood that in certain wars, mercy for men like Stone invited only more carnage. With a short, grim nod, Jon brought Longclaw down again, swift and sure. Reimer Stone's life ended in a pool of moonlit crimson. With their leader fallen, the remaining brigands either surrendered or fled. Jon's men pursued them through the night, capturing as many as they could. By dawn, a broken hush lay over the ruins. Bodies were dragged to a pyre and the camp was secured. Jon surveyed the faces of his soldiers. They were tired, some wounded, some deeply shaken. But the bandit threat had been quelled. For better or worse, it was done. Sending a raven ahead to Winterfell, Jon told Sansa that Reimer Stone's band had been routed. He would return soon, prisoners in tow. With that message, he led his group on the long road back. As they traveled, passing through the villages that had been terrorized, they were greeted with relief and sometimes tears of gratitude. Jon accepted these thanks with quiet humility. For once, the North had acted swiftly and decisively to protect its own. When he finally arrived in Winterfell's courtyard, the sun was setting, painting the walls a dusky gold. Sansa stood at the top of the steps leading to the Great Hall, Arya nearby, along with other nobles. As Jon dismounted, Sansa rushed forward, her eyes darting, searching him for wounds. He reassured her with a small smile, though the bandage around his arm spoke of the battle. Arya's expression softened, a subtle sign of approval, though she seldom wore her heart on her sleeve. Entering the Great Hall, Jon and Sansa received the cheers of assembled lords, ladies, and small folk who had gathered in thanks. Briefly, Sansa allowed a flicker of pride to show. This was the North they had dreamed of, secure, stable. The northern lords stood behind them, each seeing in their lord and lady a reflection of a stronger future. Later, when the celebrations died down and only the staff remained to clean up in hushed efficiency, Jon and Sansa retreated to their private chambers. A warm fire crackled in the hearth. Sansa helped Jon remove his armor, her fingers gentle around the straps. She gazed at the dried blood on the leather. "Does it hurt terribly?" she asked softly, gesturing to his wounded arm. Jon shook his head. "Not as much as it could have. It'll heal." He watched her carefully, noticing the slight tremble in her hand. "You were gone for weeks," she said, voice trembling with an emotion she carefully contained. I feared something would happen to you." Jon took her hands in his. "I made it back," he said quietly, brushing a strand of copper hair from her face. "And we're safer now." Sansa nodded, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. The memory of the countless times she had lost someone she loved, her father, her mother, Robb, lingered like a shadow on her. "We are," she agreed. Jon drew her into an embrace. They stood there, two weary souls leaning on each other, the weight of leadership balanced between them. In that moment, there was no king in the north, no lady of Winterfell, just two people who had fought too many battles, endured too many betrayals, but who had found in each other a reason to hope. In the days that followed, the North recognized the decisive blow Jon had struck against lawlessness. The captives were made to stand trial before the assembled council. Those who had confessed to grievous crimes were sentenced to death. Some who were coerced or who played smaller roles in the attacks were assigned labor in rebuilding the roads and fortifying the villages they had once terrorized. It was a harsh sentence, but Sansa and Jon agreed it was a balance between justice and practicality, better to have them contribute to the realm's recovery than to feed the crows. In this way, the North's sense of justice endured, tempered by mercy where possible but firm in defense of the innocent. As winter waned and the promise of a new season stirred the land, Jon and Sansa found themselves presiding over a North that was stronger than it had been in decades. The last scars of war were finally beginning to heal. And though rumors still drifted of political unrest in the south, of new claimants to the Iron Throne or old feuds simmering, Winterfell stood tall, a beacon of stability in a realm still reeling from a generation of conflict. There were banquets at times to celebrate alliances or to commemorate victories. At one such feast, held in the Great Hall, Jon and Sansa sat side by side at the high table. The hall was a riot of noise and warmth, minstrels plucked out merry tunes, and laughter rippled among the gathered lords and ladies. Great platters of roasted meats and winter vegetables were passed around, and cups overflowed with ale and mead. Watching the revelers, Jon felt a pang of surprise, as though this reality was somehow a dream. Peace and hope, friendship and laughter. They had all lived so long in the shadow of war. Even here, even now, he realized peace was fragile. But it was worth protecting. Sansa's hand rested on his arm. He glanced at her, and they shared a small, private smile. She sensed his contentment. She knew the cost of war just as well as he did, and she was grateful for every moment of respite they could gather. Standing, she called for silence. The hall fell quiet, all eyes upon her. "My lords, my ladies," she said, voice carrying that quiet strength that was uniquely hers. "We gather not just to feast, but to give thanks. Thanks for the new roads that have been built for the protection of our people. Thanks to all of you who have supported Winterfell and the North through times of darkness. Now we walk in the light of a new dawn. Our harvests show promise, our trade is recovering, and the snows are receding. None of this would be possible without our unity. And none of this would be possible without Jon Snow, the Lord of Winterfell." She gestured to Jon. The hall broke into applause, cheers erupting. Jon, never comfortable with accolades, bowed his head in modest acknowledgement. But he felt the warmth of their respect, and more importantly, he felt the unity that Sansa spoke of. This was the North he wanted, the North he would fight for. That evening, after the feast had wound down and guests had retreated to their chambers, Jon and Sansa took a walk along the castle ramparts. The cold night air was bracing, and torches cast dancing shadows on the ancient stone. Far below, the courtyard lay silent, the remains of the feast cleaned away by dutiful servants. Stars glittered overhead, bright enough to pierce the soul. They paused near a crenellation, leaning against the rough stone. Jon could see his breath in the frigid air. "I wonder what Ned Stark would think if he could see this," he mused softly, looking out across the expanse of the northern plains dusted with faint moonlight. Sansa's gaze dropped for a moment, reverent. He would be proud that Winterfell stands strong, that House Stark endures. She took a breath, her voice softening. "I only wish he could have seen it himself. I wish he could have seen us all come home." Jon nodded, a sense of longing tugging at his chest. Things would be different if he'd lived. Maybe the realm wouldn't have descended into chaos as it did. But we survived. That's what matters now. We carry his legacy. Sansa turned to him, and under the starlight, her eyes were intense. "We do. And I think that our marriage, our uniting the North, is something he would have accepted. Perhaps not initially, but he would have seen the necessity, the way forward." Jon gently took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "We're not just doing this for the sake of the North. We're doing it for ourselves, too." She smiled, a hint of contentment softening her features. "Yes, for ourselves." In the hush of that moment, with the night sky stretching infinitely above them, they shared a quiet connection that transcended words. Their bond wasn't born of childhood affection or the naive dreams Sansa once had of gallant princes. Nor was it forged by mere political strategy. It was something deeper, a kinship of two people who had walked through the fires of hardship and come out the other side, shaped by pain but not broken. In the months that followed, a rhythm settled into Winterfell's governance. Sansa excelled at managing the castle's day-to-day affairs, forging political alliances, and organizing resources. Jon took on the more martial responsibilities, ensuring the defenses were maintained, negotiating with the free folk, leading hunts for lingering threats. Together, they were an unspoken force that held the North together. They communicated constantly, counseling each other, sharing burdens, and forging a realm that valued both justice and compassion. One day, amid this peaceful era, a raven arrived bearing a message from King's Landing. A new king, distant from the chaos of the last Targaryen claim, sought to re-establish ties with the North. The letter was filled with the usual courtesies, an invitation to visit the capital, to discuss trade, to reaffirm allegiances. Jon read it, letting out a soft sigh. Sansa glanced up from her seat by the hearth. "What is it?" He handed her the scroll. She scanned it, her brows knitting. "They want us to swear fealty, to reaffirm that the North is part of the Seven Kingdoms. No doubt they wish for taxes, support, men for their wars." Jon nodded, sinking into a chair. "We've only just recovered from the last set of wars. Our people aren't eager for more." Sansa set the parchment aside. "We may not have much choice. If we isolate ourselves, the rest of Westeros might see the North as insubordinate or worse, a target. We've found peace here, but peace is rarely permanent. The South is always stirring with ambition." Jon's eyes flickered. He recalled the times he had gone south, the betrayals and heartbreak that had ensued. "We need a strategy. Perhaps we can maintain a polite relationship without entangling ourselves in their politics." Sansa studied him, the firelight dancing over her features. "We might send an envoy. That would be less of a commitment. Or we could go ourselves, demonstrate our willingness to at least listen." She paused, letting the unspoken question hang. "But is that wise?" Jon leaned back, considering. "If we go ourselves, we show respect, but also strength, that the North sends its ruler, not some minor lord. It might help us negotiate better terms." Sansa nodded. "However, leaving Winterfell for an extended period, we'd have to ensure everything here is secure, that we have a regent or a steward we trust. Bran will remain behind, of course, and he has his unique perspective. Arya might continue her own path, but she can keep an eye on any trouble. The lords loyal to us can handle local issues. But the question remains, do we want to risk re-entering the snake pit that is King's Landing?" Jon exhaled slowly, remembering how the last time he had gone south to speak of alliances, it had led to a chain of events that had nearly torn the realm apart. "I'd rather not. But perhaps we don't have a choice if we want to ensure the North isn't isolated. Let's deliberate on it, gather the council." So they did, calling upon their most trusted advisors, among them Lords Manderly, Glover, and Serwyn. Some urged caution, advocating for minimal contact with the South. Others pointed out that the North needed trade, especially for materials that could not be mined or produced in its cold climate. In the end, a decision was reached. Jon and Sansa would travel to King's Landing, if only to ensure that the North remained recognized, respected, and free to chart its own course. The journey would be undertaken in the near future, once spring had fully settled in. Word spread that the Lord and Lady of Winterfell would be traveling south. Some small folk cheered, hoping it might bring new prosperity. Others worried that meddling in southern affairs would bring back the horrors of war. Still, the wheel of fate had already turned. Winterfell set about preparing for the departure. Tents were mended, wagons readied, escorts selected. Sansa ensured that lines of command were clearly established, that the stewards knew their duties. On a brisk morning, their retinue departed Winterfell. Jon rode at the forefront, Sansa beside him, both clad in furs and leather, the direwolf sigil proudly displayed on their banners. A modest host of guards, knights, and attendants followed, enough to protect them but not so many as to seem an invading force. The gates of Winterfell opened wide, and the travelers filed out. Ghost padded silently alongside Jon's horse for a while, though he would inevitably roam at the edges of the group, ever watchful. Sansa glanced back at the castle she called home, at the battlements that had witnessed so many heartbreaks and triumphs. Now they left them behind, if only for a short time. She wondered what awaited them in King's Landing, that den of politics and shifting loyalties. The journey was not as harrowing as it might have been in winters past. Spring sunlight softened the snow, turning the once treacherous roads into muddy tracks. Yet as they rode further south, the climate warmed and the travelers shed their heavier cloaks. Along the way, they encountered scattered villagers who recognized the Stark banners and greeted them with surprise or cautious respect. Some remembered the days of war when the name Stark evoked tragedy as much as reverence. But with news of the North's resurgence, the old name carried weight once more, a testament to endurance. At Moat Cailin, they beheld the hulking ruins that marked the frontier of the North. The once formidable stronghold had fallen into disrepair, though it was still a natural choke point. Garrisoned by loyal men, it served to protect the North from invaders. They rested there briefly, exchanging courtesies with the commander, who expressed pride in Jon and Sansa's leadership. The road south continued. As they ventured beyond the neck, the terrain grew flatter and greener. Fields stretched out on either side, dotted with flowers and farmland. The retinue's mood lightened, though the weight of the approaching capital hung over them. Several days later, they came within sight of King's Landing. The city sprawled before them, sprawling walls and red-tiled roofs glinting in the midday sun. The Red Keep loomed atop the hill, an imposing structure that whispered of power and intrigue. Sansa felt a shiver run through her, remembering the last time she had been here. The ghosts of her past still lurked in those corridors: Joffrey, Cersei, Littlefinger. Those memories were tinted in fear and betrayal. But she was no longer that naive girl, and this was a different time. She glanced over at Jon, who wore a stoic expression. Neither of them had illusions about the nature of King's Landing. Their entrance into the city was an event, the people lining the streets to catch a glimpse of Jon Snow and Sansa Stark, who had both been part of stories whispered and sung across the Seven Kingdoms. Some recognized Jon from the War Against the Dead, seeing him as a legendary figure. Others peered at Sansa, recalling her as the daughter of Ned Stark, who once was betrothed to Joffrey. Murmurs filled the air, some reverent, some skeptical, some merely curious. The travelers continued, ignoring the press of gawking onlookers until they reached the gates of the Red Keep. Servants rushed forward to guide their horses away, while gold cloaks and royal guards escorted the party inside. There, in the courtyard, they were greeted by the King's Hand, a middle-aged lord with careful eyes. He offered the polite greetings demanded by courtesy, remarking on how the realm was honored to receive the Lord and Lady of Winterfell. Jon and Sansa responded with equally formal words, each aware that every phrase would be dissected for meaning. They were led to grand chambers prepared for them. Sansa noted with interest that the accommodations were much more lavish than anything in the north. Silk drapes, marble floors, and intricately carved furnishings spoke of southern opulence. Yet she longed for the rugged familiarity of Winterfell's stone walls. Jon, too, seemed uneasy in the luxuries, as though he were out of place in a gilded cage. In the following days, they navigated the intricacies of court life. The new king was a man of measured temperament, supposedly eager to heal the wounds left by his predecessors. He received Jon and Sansa with all the ceremony due their station. Courtiers watched every interaction as if searching for signs of either tension or alliance. Feasts were held in the Great Hall, with minstrels performing ballads of old wars, sometimes referencing the North and its struggles. Sansa and Jon maintained a composed demeanor, refusing to be caught off guard by flattery or hidden barbs. Over the course of negotiations, they discussed trade routes, taxes, and the official standing of the North. The king wanted to reaffirm the North as part of the realm, to ensure they paid their share of levies and contributed men in times of war. Jon, however, was adamant that the North had fought the greatest threat of all, the White Walkers, and had lost much of its population. He argued for reduced obligations, citing the devastate ion that still lingered. Sansa, with her knack for diplomacy, skillfully pointed out that strengthening the North would benefit the entire realm in the long run. If the North prospered, so too would trade and security. Meanwhile, in private, some lords approached Jon and Sansa with offers that reeked of old politics: alliance proposals, betrothals for future children, hush-hush deals to gain influence. Sansa recognized the game from her time as a captive in King's Landing. She politely declined or deflected, ensuring that no obligations were formed that could weaken the North's independence. Jon's straightforward manner often disarmed these courtiers. He neither promised nor threatened, but made it clear that he had no interest in becoming embroiled in southern intrigues. Their presence in the capital stirred curiosity, particularly regarding their marriage. Rumors flew. Some whispered that Sansa must be a cunning manipulator to tie herself to Jon Snow, whispering scurrilous tales of incest or manipulation. Others admired the unity it represented, seeing it as a romantic triumph of two Starks. Jon and Sansa learned to ignore the chatter. They had faced far worse than petty gossip. Amid these negotiations and social obligations, Jon found moments of reflection. Sometimes, late in the evening, he and Sansa would walk in the Red Keep's gardens, where lemon trees and roses bloomed in ways that would not survive the North's harsh winters. Those walks were a respite, a chance to whisper thoughts that could not be shared in crowded halls. The Red Keep held too many secrets, too many ears. But in the hush of the garden, beneath the moon's silver glow, Jon and Sansa allowed themselves the vulnerability of honest conversation. Sansa confessed her lingering fears of being trapped again in a place that once felt like a prison. Jon, in turn, spoke of the pressure he felt to maintain the North's sovereignty without inciting the wrath of the Iron Throne. They held each other's hands, exchanging solace. In those moments, they remembered that they were not just lord and lady, not just figureheads. They were partners, forging a future for their people. Finally, after weeks of delicate negotiations, a treaty was reached. The North would remain part of the Seven Kingdoms in name, but its tax burden and military obligations would be more lenient given the rebuilding efforts. In exchange, the North would allow expanded southern trade routes, fostering economic ties. Both sides proclaimed it a triumph of cooperation, though some critics in the court muttered that the North had received too many concessions. Others believed it a fair compromise. After all, the North guarded the realm against threats beyond measure. A grand feast was held to celebrate the agreement. Jon and Sansa attended, wearing the trappings of their station, Sansa in a gown of deep gray and white, embroidered with the dire wolf of House Stark, Jon in a dark doublet, similarly marked. The great hall glowed with torchlight and laughter. Dignitaries from across Westeros toasted the newly secured ties. Minstrels played a haunting melody of the North, referencing the bravery and resilience of House Stark. Sansa sipped her wine, scanning the room. She recognized the tapestry of southern politics, alliances forming in corners, smiles that never reached the eyes, whispers behind fans. She felt confident that, at least for now, they had navigated the labyrinth without being ensnared. Jon, seated beside her, maintained a calm but distant disposition. He was never one for courtly theatrics, yet his presence was notable. He had become a figurehead of a mythic war, proof that the impossible could be conquered. When the feast finally ended, they retired to their chambers, exhausted. Sansa sank into a chair, kicking off her shoes. "It's done," she murmured. "We have the agreement we needed." Jon nodded, leaning against a table. "Yes, now we can go home soon." Home. He let the word linger. Winterfell was more than just a castle. It was their identity, the heart of the North. Sansa looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "We've achieved something, Jon. We've secured peace for the North, at least for a while." He closed the distance between them, gently taking her hand. "It was never just about politics, Sansa. We're making sure our people can live without fear, without the nightmares of the past." She leaned her head against his chest. "Yes, and for once, I feel like we're truly on the same path. Not forced by circumstance, but by choice." He stroked her hair, remembering the countless hardships that had led them here. "We are on the same path. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." They departed King's Landing a few days later, leaving behind the swirl of southern intrigue. Their journey back to the North felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Along the route, they stopped at villages and small castles, now eager to return to a land that embraced them. When at last the walls of Winterfell came into view, they felt an immeasurable wave of relief and contentment. The castle stood resolute, as though greeting them with silent acceptance. Life at Winterfell resumed its familiar rhythms. The snows had fully melted in the warmer months, revealing fields of green. Farmers worked the land, merchants passed through the gates, and the great hall bustled with local affairs. Jon and Sansa took up their roles once more, presiding over council meetings, hearing petitions, resolving disputes. But there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted. The North was no longer entirely alone. It had reaffirmed its place in the wider realm, but on terms that respected its unique identity and hardships. In the privacy of their lives, Jon and Sansa grew closer yet. They learned to trust each other's judgments and to discuss every important decision, weaving a tapestry of shared rule. Their bond deepened, not just in governance but in quiet domesticity. Sometimes they would walk by the godswood or watch from the battlements as the sun set beyond the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. They both carried scars, physical and emotional, but together they had forged something stronger. Over time, whispers spread through the castle and beyond that the Lady of Winterfell was with child. Such rumors were first heard in hushed corridors, then in excited murmurs among the small folk. Hope blossomed. A child of House Stark of this union would symbolize a new generation, a fresh chapter for the North. When finally Sansa's pregnancy was confirmed, the castle erupted in joy. Bells rang out and the lords and ladies flocked to offer their congratulations. Jon, though he tried to maintain his usual composure, could not contain a quiet smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. He remembered his own uncertain upbringing, the label of bastard he had carried so long. Now his child would be born in wedlock with the names of Stark and Targaryen woven together, though the latter was seldom invoked openly, for they knew that names stirred complicated feelings across the realm. Still, it was a child of House Stark in a very real sense, the next line in an ancient legacy. Sansa's pregnancy only seemed to heighten her resolve. She continued her duties, though Jon insisted she rest more often, placing protective measures around her. Midwives were called upon, the best in the north. The people of Winterfell prepared for a birth that felt as though it would herald a new age. And though Jon and Sansa had their private anxieties, fear of potential complications of uncertain times, they also felt a thrill of anticipation for the future taking shape. As the months passed, the north flourished. Trade routes that Sansa had negotiated brought new goods to market stalls. Farmers and hunters reported bountiful yields. The fortress walls were reinforced, new watchtowers built. A sense of pride crept back into the hearts of northerners who saw House Stark leading the way with integrity and unity. Even the lords who once questioned Jon's position as a former bastard had softened. They saw in his leadership honor and the willingness to lay down his life for the north. Occasionally, envoys from King's Landing came to check on the north to maintain the tenuous alliance. But these visits were short and cordial, lacking the tension of the past. The presence of a Stark heir on the way quelled rumors of instability. There would be a clear line of succession in Winterfell. In the Great Hall, tapestries were woven, depicting dire wolves against a snowy backdrop. Stories spread of the battles Jon had fought and the cunning with which Sansa had outmaneuvered the realm's greatest threats. When the time of the birth arrived, a hush fell over Winterfell. Sansa labored in her chambers, attended by midwives. Jon, restless and anxious, paced the corridor outside, glancing at the doors each time a muffled cry or instruction reached his ears. Hours passed, and though the night deepened, the entire castle seemed to hold its breath. Then, at long last, a sharp cry pierced the silence, an infant's wail. The door opened and the midwife beckoned Jon inside with a radiant smile. He entered to find Sansa exhausted but glowing, cradling a small bundle in her arms. Her hair clung to her forehead and her eyes brimmed with tears of joy and relief. Jon approached cautiously, his heart pounding like a war drum. The midwife gently lifted a corner of the swaddling blanket, revealing a tiny face. The baby looked up at them, eyes scrunched, voice already strong in that piercing newborn cry. "A daughter," Sansa whispered, gazing at Jon with a mix of wonder and triumph. "We have a daughter." Jon knelt beside them, hardly daring to breathe. He reached out a trembling finger and the baby's tiny hand curled around it. In that instant, the weight of everything they had endured, wars, betrayals, near-death experiences, coalesced into a single, overwhelming emotion. He leaned forward, pressing his lips to Sansa's forehead, tears threatening to spill from his own eyes. Sansa smiled, her own tears trickling down her cheeks. "She's perfect." Jon swallowed hard, gazing at the tiny life in his arms. "She is," he murmured, a fierce protectiveness surging through him. Word spread quickly through Winterfell. Bells tolled in celebration. Lords and ladies came forth to offer blessings and gifts. Small folk clapped and cheered in the courtyard. A great feast was declared. The birth of a child to Lord Jon Snow and Lady Sansa Stark symbolized not just the continuation of House Stark, but the promise of a future free from the terrors that had once consumed them. In the weeks that followed, Sansa recovered her strength. Jon, when not occupied by the demands of rulership, spent quiet moments in the solar, rocking his daughter, who they named Lyanna in honor of his mother and the Stark lineage. Ghost would occasionally nose at the cradle, a gentle sentinel. Servants whispered that Ghost seemed calmer than usual, as though recognizing the new pack member. The presence of a child changed the atmosphere within Winterfell in profound ways. People began to speak with renewed hope. If House Stark could produce a healthy heir after all that had transpired, perhaps the darkest days were truly behind them. Jon and Sansa saw it as an opportunity to lead with empathy, to create a realm where innocence would not be ravaged by the ambitions of the powerful. A year passed and peace endured. The occasional raven arrived with tidings from the south or beyond the narrow sea, but none seemed dire enough to shake the north's stability. The child grew, receiving the adoration of all who met her. Within the walls of Winterfell, she was cherished, a living testament to the union of Jon and Sansa. And so it came to be that the North was truly united, perhaps for the first time in living memory. The old feuds and doubts diminished under a leadership that respected tradition but was not shackled by it. The people looked to Winterfell and saw two figures they trusted: Jon Snow, once a bastard and a hero of the Wall, and Sansa Stark, once a victim of courtly intrigue, now a brilliant leader in her own right. Together, they embodied the resilience of the North. Whenever Jon stood on the battlements in the late twilight, the wind teasing his cloak, he thought of the ghosts that had walked there before him. He thought of Ned Stark, who had once taught him honor. He thought of the countless men and women who had sacrificed their lives so the living could see another sunrise. Now, as the Lord of Winterfell, husband to Sansa, father to Lyanna, he felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. The weight of his name, both Stark and Targaryen, no longer felt like a burden but a responsibility he willingly shouldered. Sansa, too, found a profound sense of peace. No longer the frightened girl in King's Landing, no longer the captive who endured torture in Winterfell's own halls, she had become a leader in every sense. She had discovered that her childhood dreams of being a queen were nothing compared to the reality of protecting a kingdom. Yet she discovered that the real beauty lay not in crowns or pageantry but in the steady work of governance, the forging of alliances based on mutual respect, the love she shared with Jon and the child they were raising. In this new era, the words of House Stark, "Winter is coming," carried a different meaning. They were not a herald of doom, but a reminder of vigilance, of the need to stay humble and prepared even in times of peace. And yet, there was warmth to be found in the North, a warmth born of unity and compassion, of the knowledge that no threat was insurmountable when the pack stood together. And so the North was united forever under their rule. Within the ancient halls of Winterfell, the union of Jon Snow and Sansa Stark stood as a testament to what could be achieved when love, loyalty, and wisdom guided those in power. Unburdened by the wheel of southern politics, strengthened by the trials they had overcome, they governed a realm that was proud, loyal, and strong, forging a future brighter than any that their broken past might have foretold. Jon Snow stood atop the ramparts of Winterfell and surveyed the courtyard below, exhaling in the icy morning air. A year had passed since the birth of his and Sansa's daughter, Lyanna. In that time, life at the castle had settled into a peace that many believed was more solid than any in living memory. The North was strong, its people optimistic. There were no White Walkers to fear and no looming civil wars in the Seven Kingdoms, at least not at the moment. For once, the North had the rare luxury of focusing on its own prosperity, a small miracle in a land scarred by tragedy. Jon could see the bustle of the castle's morning routine, servants carrying steaming kettles of porridge, stable boys brushing horses, guards switching shifts at the gates. Winterfell was alive in a way it hadn't been for a very long time. The keep itself seemed to breathe with new purpose, reflecting the unity Jon and Sansa had forged. Snow still clung to the corners of the courtyard, but patches of clear ground hinted at the approaching spring. Beyond the walls, the pale sky promised a day of bright sunshine, a sign, perhaps, that the North was finally stepping into a gentler era. He turned to watch Lyanna's nursemaid walk along the courtyard with the child's hand in hers. Even at a distance, Jon's heart stirred at the sight. Lyanna was a small figure in a warm woolen cloak, toddling unsteadily, fascinated by everything around her. Whenever Jon found himself mired in the memory of darker days, her home, the long night, betrayals, and brutal battles, Lyanna's laughter would unravel the knots within him. She was the reminder that a future could exist without endless strife, that love could carve out a safe haven even in a brutal world. Jon came a familiar voice from behind. He turned to see Sansa approaching with a brisk, graceful step. Her copper hair was bound in a single braid, and her cheeks were flushed with cold. She wore a thick gray cloak trimmed with fur, the sigil of House Stark embroidered along the hem. Even after years of hardship, she retained a regal bearing, tempered by kindness in her eyes. She paused beside him at the battlements, gazing down into the courtyard. A small smile curved her lips when she spotted their daughter. "How long have you been out here?" she asked softly. Jon shrugged, letting out a visible puff of breath. "Not too long. The morning was calm and I needed a moment to think." He noticed Sansa's gaze shifting from their child to the watchtowers and gates. "Any news from the south?" she asked. "A raven arrived at dawn." Jon leaned against the cold stone. "King's Landing wants to formalize a new trade agreement we negotiated last year. They're sending an emissary, maybe two. Should arrive before the month's end." Sansa sighed. "More southern visitors. I suppose it's unavoidable. The realm has begun to mend and we can't turn a blind eye to the rest of the kingdom. If trade can flourish, so can the North." Jon nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. Even if his heart still held reservations about southern politics, he knew it was wiser for the North not to isolate itself. "It's the same treaty we drafted with the new king. Only details remain to be settled. I suspect this is more of a formality." A wry smile touched Sansa's lips. "Formality or not, southern lords never miss an opportunity to remind us we're part of the Seven Kingdoms." Before Jon could respond, a squeal of delight echoed from below. Lyanna, guided by her nursemaid, had discovered Ghost waiting near the stables. The direwolf, still formidable with his white fur and red eyes, nuzzled her tiny hand with surprising gentleness. Jon felt a pang in his chest, remembering the days when Ghost was his only companion at the wall. Now, the direwolf had become the protector of the next generation of Starks. "Sansa," Jon began, shifting his weight as he clasped his hands together, "how do you feel about them coming here? The southern emissaries?" She considered for a moment. "I'm not fond of hosting the kind of courtly games that can turn malicious in an instant. But I don't believe we have anything to fear. The realm knows we won't be easily manipulated. Besides, we have the advantage here. Winterfell is our home and we have no illusions left to shatter." Jon half-smiled. "True enough. We'll manage." They stood there quietly for a moment, a comfortable silence wrapping them like a blanket. Then Sansa placed a gentle hand on Jon's arm. "Come inside soon. We'll meet with the stewards about arrangements for our guests. Then we should spend time with Lyanna before the day overwhelms us." Jon leaned in and pressed a brief, warm kiss to Sansa's temple. He never took for granted the closeness they had achieved. The childlike Sansa of old, with her naive dreams of knights and ballads, was gone. So, too, was the uncertain boy haunted by the label of bastard. Now they were two people who had lived through darkness and crafted a future from the ashes. The vow they had made under the heart tree, sealed by love and necessity, continued to guide them. "I'll be in shortly," he promised. Sansa nodded, a lingering smile in her eyes, and made her way back down the steps. Watching her retreating figure, Jon reflected on how far they'd come. Winterfell, once battered by war and betrayal, stood strong. The people trusted House Stark again, and Jon had slowly grown into his role. Though the demands were endless, this was a burden he chose willingly for Sansa, for Lyanna, for the North. He looked to the horizon, his breath fogging the air. Birds drifted across the sky in a pale smear of gray and white, heading beyond the walls. The thought struck him that peace was a fleeting thing, always in need of vigilant defense. But for now, Winterfell was alive and safe. Jon knew better than most that such a reprieve should be cherished. Jon made his way down the ramparts and through the courtyard. He stopped to greet several guards with a few polite words. Their eyes shone with respect when they saw him. Passing the stables, he noted the repairs completed over the winter. Horses neighed softly as stable hands moved among them, shoveling hay and checking hooves. Ghost raised his head, ears flicking, but he remained beside Lyanna, watchful yet calm. Jon paused near his daughter, going down on one knee to meet her eye level. The nursemaid curtsied, but Lyanna grinned at her father, a toothy smile forming on her round face. She was a child of the North, her hair was dark like Jon's, but she had Sansa's fine bone structure and, some said, a glimmer of Ned Stark in her solemn expression. She reached for him, babbling in excitement, and Jon felt the immense warmth of fatherhood flood him. He lifted her in his arms, letting her tiny fingers curl in his hair. He could already see the quiet determination in her eyes, a curiosity about the world. One day she might walk the halls of Winterfell as its lady or roam beyond them if she chose. The thought was both humbling and awe-inspiring. "Shall we go see your mother?" he murmured. She responded with an unintelligible gurgle, patting his cheek. Ghost snorted softly, as if approving, and trotted off to find a shady spot. Cradling Lyanna, Jon moved inside the keep, navigating corridors lit by torches. Shadows flickered across the walls. Servants hurried past with trays of bread, salted meats, and fresh water. Somewhere deeper within, a group of guards clattered as they drilled in the practice yard. It was all so ordinary, yet it felt extraordinary to Jon. This was life, free from the shackles of endless warfare. He found Sansa in a small council chamber, conferring with Maester Wolkan and their steward, a serious-minded young man named Clay. A table before them was spread with scrolls, lists, and small wooden markers representing resources. Sansa looked up at Jon and Lyanna's entrance, her face softening. Maester Wolkan bowed slightly. "My lord, we were just going over the allocations for the coming weeks. The stewards report an abundance of winter stores left unused, thanks to the mild season." Sansa gestured to an open chair. "Take a seat, Jon. We can settle these matters quickly." Jon obliged, settling Lyanna on his lap. The little girl's bright eyes flicked from the maester to Sansa, then to the steward. She seemed content just to observe, as though absorbing the world through every sense. Maester Wolkan continued, "We have surplus grains, salted fish, and preserved vegetables. With the roads open earlier than usual, trade caravans from White Harbor can carry our surplus south. The Crown's emissaries might find favorable prices here. It could bolster our coffers." Sansa nodded in agreement. "We could use additional revenue for continued fortifications along the eastern border." House Glover has reported minor troubles, wolves and occasional rogue bandits. Nothing dire, but we need to keep watchtowers manned. Jon listened, letting the conversation wash over him. These were the kind of details that secured peace, the small decisions about trade, supply, and defense that prevented any threat from taking root unnoticed. He remembered how ill-equipped the Night's Watch had been before the war with the White Walkers, how a lack of resources had undermined morale. Never again, he vowed. The North must remain vigilant. He joined the discussion, suggesting that they designate a portion of the surplus for local distribution, especially to the small folk in outlying villages who might still be recovering from the hardships of the past decade. Sansa nodded, approving. They soon concluded that half of the surplus would go to trade, the rest reserved for local needs or sold at fair prices to northerners who had limited means. The steward took careful notes, and Maester Wolken moved on to the next matter. Midway through the meeting, Lyanna wriggled impatiently. She reached for the pile of wooden markers on the table, which represented shipments of grain. Jon gave her one to play with, mindful that she might start scattering them across the floor. She cooed in delight, and Sansa watched her with an affectionate smile. When they were done, the steward and Maester Wolken gathered their scrolls and excused themselves, leaving Jon, Sansa, and Lyanna alone in the chamber. A comfortable silence prevailed for a moment, the hush interrupted only by Lyanna's playful babbling. "You're getting good at these meetings," Sansa teased Jon lightly. "I remember when you'd sooner face a white than discuss trade agreements." Jon shrugged. "Give me a sword, and I know what to do. But these days," he glanced at their daughter, "these days require a different kind of battle." Sansa reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "And you're winning it. We're winning it." Their moment was broken by a knock at the door. A guard stepped in, announcing that Lord Robard Manderly had arrived unexpectedly from White Harbor. Jon and Sansa exchanged curious looks. House Manderly was a staunch ally, but a surprise visit was unusual. White Harbor lay far to the southeast, a busy trade hub. If Robard had traveled this distance without sending word, something significant must be afoot. "Show him to the Great Hall," Sansa instructed, rising. "We'll receive him there." Jon placed Lyanna in the nursemaid's arms, who had just arrived outside, then followed Sansa out the door. They walked through corridors lined with flickering torches until they emerged in the cavernous expanse of the Great Hall. Newly polished banners of House Stark draped the walls, the direwolf emblem shimmering in silver. At the far end of the hall, near the dais, stood Lord Robard Manderly, flanked by two of his knights. He was a broad-shouldered man in his middle years, sporting a well-trimmed beard flecked with gray. His expression was grave. Jon and Sansa advanced to greet him. "Lord Robard," Jon said, "we welcome you to Winterfell. We hadn't expected to see you so soon after your last visit." Robard bowed, then straightened. "My lord, my lady, I wish this were a courtesy call, but I fear I bring troubling news. There have been incidents on the seas near White Harbor." Sansa's brow knitted. "Pirates?" Manderly shook his head. "We first thought so, but it appears these are Ironborn raiders. A handful of fishing vessels were attacked off the coast. Survivors tell us the attackers bore the Kraken sigil of House Greyjoy. We believe they're from the Iron Islands, or else a group of Ironborn exiles operating under that banner." Jon's jaw tightened. Memories of the Ironborn from the War of the Five Kings still lingered. Have they threatened White Harbor itself? "Not directly," Robard replied, "but the fishermen say the raiders are becoming bolder, striking further north with each passing week. So far, they've confined themselves to isolated ships and smaller coastal villages. I fear it's only a matter of time before they strike a more significant target." Sansa shared a concerned glance with Jon. The Iron Islands had been a source of turmoil for generations. Yara Greyjoy had once tried to steer her people away from reckless raiding, but who knew what had happened since? Jon folded his arms. "Have you sent word to Pike or attempted to contact any legitimate Greyjoy authority?" "We did, but we've received no response. Rumor has it that the leadership there is fractured. Yara Greyjoy's position might be contested by others who still pine for the old ways. Some might be taking advantage of that instability to return to Reaving." Sansa's voice was calm yet urgent. "We can't afford to let them disrupt our coasts. White Harbor is our gateway to trade. If word spreads that the harbor is unsafe, merchants will avoid it." "Precisely." Manderly exhaled, tension evident in his posture. We need a plan. My fleet can protect the harbor to some extent, but if the Ironborn grow bolder, I may need reinforcements. I came to request more men, or at least some guidance. We must stand united. Jon glanced at Sansa. He recalled how the Ironborn had once taken advantage of northern distractions to seize parts of the coastline. That had ended in bloodshed for both sides. The North had no desire to reignite old feuds, but they couldn't ignore this threat. We'll help, Jon said. The first step is to confirm the scope of these raids. We need accurate information. How many raiders are there, how organized, and what exactly are their objectives? Sansa nodded. We should send ravens to the Vale as well, see if they've encountered similar threats along the eastern shore. And to the Crown. They have a stake in ensuring the seas are safe. Lord Robard bowed, relief evident on his face. Thank you, my lord, my lady. White Harbor stands ready to coordinate. They spoke at length, discussing immediate measures, dispatching scouts, patrolling the coast, and assembling a small contingent of soldiers who could be sent on short notice. Lord Robard was also keen on offering a bounty for any reliable sails willing to guard merchant ships until the threat was contained. Sansa and Jon approved the plan, promising additional resources as soon as feasible. When Robard departed to rest from his journey, Jon and Sansa were left by the dais, the great hall now empty save for a few lingering guards. Sansa massaged her temples, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. Just as we begin to believe in peace, trouble stirs, she said softly. Jon placed a hand on her shoulder. It might be a small group, not a full-scale invasion, but we have to take it seriously. The North's hold on stability can't be undercut by raiders. She nodded, drawing a steadying breath. And if it's more than just a few reavers? If there's a faction of Ironborn that wants to resurrect the old ways, they'll look at our coasts as fair game. Jon's gaze hardened. Then we'll deal with them. The North is not the same as it once was. We're prepared and we won't be caught off guard. Still, worry simmered in Sansa's eyes, and Jon felt it too. The notion of sending northern men to fight on ships was daunting. Naval battles were not the North's strong suit, and the Ironborn excelled on the sea. White Harbor's fleet was respectable, but hardly a match for a well-organized Ironborn assault if one emerged. Diplomacy might be the first step. Perhaps Yara Greyjoy, if she still held any power, could be reasoned with. But if chaos reigned in the islands, reason might not hold much weight. They parted to draft letters, one to the Crown, another to the Vale, and a third to the Manderleys reaffirming their support. Maester Wolkan would see the ravens dispatched by nightfall. So began a new chapter of uncertainty. While it was nowhere near as dire as the undead threat they had once faced, even a small conflict could disrupt the hard-won peace. And lurking behind every corner of Westeros were opportunists waiting to exploit any vulnerability. The North had to stand firm. That evening, after finishing their tasks, Jon and Sansa found a moment of quiet in their private quarters. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the thick carpets. Sansa sat on the edge of a chaise, brushing her long hair free of braids. Jon leaned against a carved wooden post of the bed, arms folded, thoughts distant. She glanced up. "You're worried." He breathed out slowly. "I just don't want a minor skirmish to spiral. The North's seen enough blood. And these are not our waters. We're at a disadvantage." Sansa set aside her brush, rising to her feet. She moved closer, her gaze steady. "We'll be careful. We'll plan. We'll coordinate with allies. The days when the North stood alone are behind us. Even if we're at a disadvantage at sea, we have alliances on land that could deter the Ironborn." Jon nodded, drawing Sansa into a loose embrace. Her warmth and resolve steadied him. Despite the challenges, he felt a surge of gratitude that they faced them side by side. "You're right," he said. "We're not alone." She rested her head against his chest, sighing. "Tomorrow, we'll talk more with Robard and finalize a plan of action. Then we'll wait for replies from our ravens. Until then, let's hold on to the calm that remains." Jon wrapped his arms around her, inhaling the faint scent of lavender in her hair. For a moment, they stood in silence, absorbing the closeness. The corridor outside was quiet, the occasional echo of footsteps reminding them that they were never truly alone in Winterfell. Yet this chamber was theirs, a sanctuary. Eventually, they retired for the night, slipping beneath heavy furs. In the darkness, Jon lay awake, listening to Sansa's soft breaths. He recalled the hush of the far north, the swirl of snow that had once been his only companion. Now he had a family, a home, a future. He prayed that the old gods, or the new, or whatever forces governed their fates, would allow this peace to endure. Days passed, and ravens soared from Winterfell, carrying urgent words to the Vale, the Crown, and beyond. The palace at King's Landing replied quickly, acknowledging the threat but offering limited immediate help. The Vale expressed concern, promising to keep an eye on the Gultown harbor. The Manderleys returned to White Harbor with a small contingent of Winterfell soldiers and instructions to gather intelligence before taking aggressive action. While they waited for more news, life continued. Sansa oversaw the expansion of farmland around Winterfell, leveraging the mild spring for a better harvest. Jon inspected the watchtowers along the King's Road, ensuring that if the Ironborn tried a land approach, they would be met with steel. Through it all, Lyanna was a joyful distraction. She had begun toddling faster, and her curiosity led her into every nook and cranny of the castle. Servants found her poking at dust motes in sunlit corners or babbling at the tapestry of a dire wolf. She often trailed after Ghost in a wobbly chase, the dire wolf permitting her antics with stoic patience. Then one afternoon, a group of weary fishermen from the northern coast near the Flint Cliffs arrived at Winterfell. They reported a brutal raid on their village, a small hamlet known for herring and cod. Many had died and several were taken captive on the Ironborn ships. The survivors had fled inland, uncertain where else to go. The fisherman's account left no doubt that these raiders were indeed Ironborn, led by a captain who flew the Kraken banner and spoke of claiming the North Shores as their rightful plunder. Jon and Sansa received the fishermen in the Great Hall, hearing their stories in grim silence. The men's voices shook with anger and grief. They described homes set aflame, loved ones carried off, the sea stained red. Listening, Jon felt a familiar surge of righteous fury. The Ironborn might not threaten the entire North yet, but they had shattered these lives. That was enough. "We'll not let this stand," Sansa said, her voice tight. "You'll have our protection and justice. We will coordinate with Lord Manderley and see these raiders pay for what they've done." The fishermen bowed gratefully, though fear still haunted their eyes. Jon directed the stewards to arrange temporary lodging for them, as well as any survivors they could locate. They would also send word to White Harbor about the attack, urging Manderley to move swiftly. When the fishermen left, Sansa turned to Jon with a grim resolve. "If we do nothing, more villages will burn. The Ironborn might see us as weak. They'll keep pushing until they overreach. We need to strike first." Jon rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling. "I know, but how? If we send a large force by land to White Harbor, it won't solve the problem at sea. We have no immediate fleet in the north aside from the Manderley's ships." She pursed her lips thoughtfully. "Then we might have to enlist help from other coastal lords or even from the south. If the crown wants its trade routes intact, they should be more motivated to help." Jon's eyes flickered with the memory of southern politics. "They might demand a high price in men or gold, but we'll consider it." He paused, thinking of another angle. What of the Greyjoys themselves? Yara, if she still holds any influence, might reign in these raiders. Sansa considered. "We tried sending word to Pike, but no reply came. Perhaps we should send an envoy directly to the Iron Islands. Someone who can make it clear that this reaving won't be tolerated. We could threaten retaliation if they don't stop." Jon's expression hardened. "I'll not negotiate with those who slaughtered innocents. But maybe there's a chance Yara or another legitimate ruler can curb this. Otherwise, we'll be forced into open conflict." Later that day, they convened a council of their most trusted advisors in the Solar. Maester Wolkan, Lord Glover, who happened to be at Winterfell, and Ser Alistair, the Master-at-Arms. They debated strategies, resources, and potential alliances. The question of who to send to the Iron Islands, if anyone, loomed large. It was dangerous, but ignoring them might be costlier still. Lord Glover, arms folded, was vehemently against any sort of embassy. They're raiders by nature. Diplomacy won't sway them, and they respect only strength. We should gather a fleet, hire sails if needed, and meet them on the open water. Sansa shook her head. Easier said than done. We lack the gold and ships for a rapid expansion of naval power. The Manderleys have enough to guard White Harbor, not to launch an invasion of the Iron Islands. Ser Alistair spoke up. There might be another route. If these raiders are acting without the full support of House Greyjoy, we could exploit that. A small, swift strike against their strongholds along the coast might scatter them. We can't hold the seas, but we can force them to defend their own territory. Jon listened, weighing each idea. We need more intelligence, he decided. We can't commit to a war without knowing exactly what we're up against. Let's see if Lord Manderley can capture a few raiders alive, learn who commands them and how many ships they have." Sansa agreed, her voice calm but resolute. "We'll send another raven to Pike, state plainly that if they don't rein in these outlaws, the North will consider itself at war with the Iron Islands. That might draw a response, even if it's just a threat. We'll know where we stand." The council concluded with the plan to gather intelligence and to issue a final warning to House Greyjoy. If no progress was made, the North would take decisive action. The men dispersed, each carrying a measure of responsibility for the coming days. As the door closed, Jon met Sansa's gaze. A silent understanding passed between them. They were once again on the brink of conflict, but this time they were better prepared, older, and wiser. That night, the wind keened around the towers of Winterfell as though echoing the tension inside. Jon patrolled the courtyard, stopping by the stables to ensure the horses were properly cared for. Ghost padded beside him. The direwolf seemed restless, lifting his head to sniff the air. Something in the breeze hinted at change, perhaps the iron tang of a far-off threat. Eventually, Jon retired to his chambers, finding Sansa by the fire, reading a letter. She looked up, her expression half somber, half determined. "It's from the fishermen who fled their village. They're asking if they can settle permanently near Winterfell. They've lost everything." Jon moved to stand behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "We can give them land. Plenty of villages need more hands to work the fields. It might help them start anew." Sansa nodded, setting the letter aside. "We'll do it. I've already drafted a response. We've faced so much sorrow, Jon. If there's a chance to bring even a small measure of relief, we must take it." He squeezed her shoulders gently, then pulled up a chair beside her. In the flickering glow of the hearth, they spoke about the future, about how to ensure their children, Lyanna and any others who might come, would not inherit a realm defined by endless war. They had fought for a new dawn, but darkness still existed in pockets. Perhaps it always would. Yet Sansa reminded Jon that the fight for peace was never truly over, just as the fight for survival never ceased in the North. In the weeks that followed, tensions escalated. Reports came of more raids along the coast. Lord Manderley's fleet had minor skirmishes at sea, driving off a few raider vessels but failing to capture any for interrogation. The Iron Islands remained silent, no raven arrived, no envoy stepped forward. It was as if the islands had chosen to shut themselves off from the outside world, leaving reavers free to pillage as they pleased. Eventually, Jon and Sansa received news that White Harbor's patrol had managed to cripple an Ironborn longship near a rocky inlet. The ship ran aground and several crewmen were captured. Lord Manderley sent word that he would interrogate them immediately and expected to glean valuable information about their leader. Jon decided to travel to White Harbor himself, sensing this was the pivotal moment. Preparations for the journey began swiftly. Jon would take a small escort of trusted men, including Ser Alistair and a handful of knights. Sansa would remain at Winterfell, overseeing governance and caring for Lyanna. Initially, she considered accompanying him but decided her presence was vital in case events took a sudden turn. If the Ironborn decided to strike inland or if other matters demanded leadership, she would need to be at the castle. Early one morning, Jon stood in the courtyard, dressed in travel leathers and a thick cloak. Sansa was there to see him off, holding Lyanna's hand as the child fussed against the chill. Horses pawed the ground and men checked their gear. Snow swirled in gusts, the northern weather reminding them that spring was still a tentative guest. "You'll come back soon," Sansa said quietly, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Jon nodded. "I will. Once I've heard what the prisoners have to say, I'll decide our next move. We might have to respond decisively if they confirm a larger threat." She swallowed, her gaze unwavering. "Do what must be done. But be cautious. The Ironborn can be treacherous and we don't know how far this rebellion extends." He placed a hand on her cheek, allowing himself a moment of tenderness despite the onlookers. "I'll be careful." Then he glanced at Lyanna, who looked up at him with wide eyes. "Take care of your mother, little one." The child made a soft sound, wrapping her arms around Sansa's leg. Jon felt a twinge in his heart but steeled himself. Duty awaited. With a final nod, he mounted his horse, leading the small column out of Winterfell's gates. The banners bearing the direwolf's sigil fluttered behind them. The journey to White Harbor took several days under gray skies. The King's Road was clear, though muddy from intermittent snowmelt. The men rode in disciplined silence, occasionally breaking into quiet conversation. Every so often, Ghost vanished into the surrounding countryside, reappearing at night to bed down near Jon. The presence of the dire wolf was a comfort, a reminder that the old ways of the North still thrived. As they approached White Harbor, the land flattened, giving way to rolling fields and salt marshes. The city itself appeared in the distance, a cluster of white stone walls and towers. Its harbor bristled with ships, merchant vessels, fishing boats, and Lord Manderley's war galleys. Smoke rose from chimneys and a light drizzle began to fall, making the cobblestones slick. Inside the city walls, people bustled with a guarded sense of urgency. Jon and his men were welcomed warmly, but the tension was palpable. Stories of the Ironborn raids had spread, dampening trade and making the local population wary. Stepping into the great hall of the Merman's Court, Jon found Lord Robard Manderley in discussion with a few of his captains. The Lord greeted Jon with a respectful bow and ushered him to a long table strewn with maps and dispatches. "My lord," Manderley began, "we've had limited success at sea. The Ironborn are cunning, striking under cover of darkness or storms. But we did capture half a dozen from the ship we stranded. They're defiant, but we've gleaned a name." Jon pulled off his gloves, leaning over the table. "Whose name?" "A woman called Helia Pike, apparently claiming some old link to the Greyjoy line. She's said to have 5 longships under her command, possibly more. They speak of her as though she's part zealot, part warlord. She believes the old ways of the Ironborn must be resurrected in full, reaving enthralls, pillaging the northern coasts, the works." Jon grimaced. "And Yara Greyjoy?" Manderley shook his head. "No word. The prisoners claim this Helia despises Yara for her attempts to bring peace and modernization to the Iron Islands." One of Manderley's captains, a grizzled man named Quentin, spoke up. "We found relics of the drowned god aboard their ship and they ranted about drowning the North in salt and iron. They're fanatics." Jon felt a swirl of frustration and anger. The idea of the Ironborn returning to the old ways was more than a nuisance, it was an existential threat to innocent coastal dwellers. If she truly leads 5 or more ships, that's enough to wreak havoc. "We can't wait for them to gather strength." Manderley nodded in agreement. "We've tried to match them at sea, but they slip away. It's like chasing smoke in the wind. Our best chance might be to lure them into a trap or strike at their base of operations. The question is, where?" Jon studied the map, tracing a finger along the coastline. The Iron Islands were far to the southwest, but these raiders could hide in countless coves or uncharted inlets. "We need more scouts. What if we send fast ships out disguised as merchant vessels to bait them into an attack? If they take the bait, we can converge on them with our warships." Quentin tapped the table. "We've discussed that. It's risky, but it might be our best shot to force a confrontation." Jon turned back to Manderley. "I'll coordinate with you. We'll prepare an ambush. If this Helia Pike is truly out there, we'll give her one chance to surrender. If she refuses, we end this threat by force." Manderley glanced at a letter bearing the royal seal from King's Landing. "The Crown says they'll send a small detachment in a few weeks, but it could be too late. We can't afford to wait." Jon nodded, steeling himself. "Then we move ahead without them. If we succeed quickly, we'll have proven the North can defend itself. If we fail, we'll need the Crown's reinforcements. Let's not fail." So the plan took shape. A merchant vessel, outwardly laden with precious cargo, furs, perhaps, or grain, would sail along a known route used by the Ironborn raiders. Hidden in its hold would be Manderley's best fighters. Nearby, several war galleys would lie in wait, out of sight but ready to spring into action once the raiders appeared. The goal was to board and capture at least one of Helia's ships, hoping to either seize her or gather intelligence that would lead them to her lair. They spent days preparing, gathering supplies, and selecting the crew. Jon involved himself in every detail, from the choice of camouflage for the deckhands to the distribution of swords and crossbows below deck. While not a seasoned naval commander, he relied on Manderley's expertise. In turn, Manderley respected Jon's leadership and unwavering determination. Finally, the trap was set. On a cold morning when sea fog shrouded the horizon, the merchant ship, christened the North Wind for the mission, set sail. Jon watched from the docks as the vessel disappeared into the gray gloom. Then he boarded one of Manderley's galleys, the Sea Lion, which would remain hidden behind a rocky outcropping to the east, along with 2 other warships. The day was long and tense. Sea spray stung Jon's face as the wind picked up. Crewmen moved quietly, exchanging terse whispers. Hours dragged on. The sky remained overcast, and the ocean swelled with restless waves. Now and then, gulls screeched overhead, the only living sounds in the damp hush. Suddenly, near dusk, a lookout on the mast shouted that he spotted sails. Jon craned his neck, peering over the rail. Far across the water, faint silhouettes broke through the mist, 3 ships, dark hulls cutting through the waves. A signal flare from the north wind soared into the sky, a burst of orange in the twilight. The The trap had been sprung. Manderley's ships lunged into action. Oars dipped, sails unfurled, and the war galleys glided forward, hugging the coastline to remain unseen until the last possible moment. Jon gripped the edge of the deck, heart pounding. He had faced battles against the undead and the living alike, but rarely at sea. The creak of timbers, the hiss of the surf, it all felt alien. Yet the stakes were just as high. As they rounded a craggy spit of land, the scene opened before them. The north wind was flanked by 2 Ironborn longships, grappling hooks already slung over the rails. The reavers were preparing to board. The third enemy ship stood a short distance away, likely waiting to see if the prize was worth the fight. Manderley's war horns blared, echoing across the water. The Ironborn spun around in alarm, sails rustling as they tried to maneuver. The Sea Lion's deck erupted in motion. Archers lined the rails, loosing arrows that arced through the air. Some found their mark, striking Ironborn who scrambled for cover. The war galleys slammed into the fray, ramming the nearest longship. Wood splintered with a sickening crunch, and men toppled overboard, screaming into the frothing sea. Jon found himself in the thick of it, adrenaline surging. With Ghost left behind at White Harbor, ships were no place for a direwolf. Jon felt a pang of regret, but focused on the task at hand. He shouted orders to the men, who boarded the crippled longship with grappling lines. Steel clashed as the Ironborn fought back, their axes and short swords whirling in savage arcs. The second Ironborn ship tried to pull away, but the North Wind's hidden fighters, now unleashed, attacked from within. Jon glimpsed men in House Manderley colors surging onto the Ironborn deck, cutting down reavers who were caught by surprise. Blood stained the wet planks, and bodies slid across the deck. The stench of salt, sweat, and death filled the air. Meanwhile, the third Ironborn ship turned sharply, hoisting its sails in an attempt to flee. One of Manderley's smaller galleys gave chase, but the longship's sleek design allowed it to slip away into the thickening fog. Jon cursed under his breath. Losing that ship meant they couldn't be sure if Heliopike was aboard. Still, victory was within reach. The battered Ironborn, trapped between the 2 war galleys and the North Wind, had nowhere to go. Some threw down their weapons while others chose to fight to the last breath. Jon personally disarmed a raging reaver, knocking the axe from his hand with a well-timed blow. The man snarled and lunged, but Jon sidestepped, driving his pommel into the Ironborn's temple. The reaver collapsed unconscious. When the battle finally ended, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Torches lit the decks, revealing the carnage. Bodies lay strewn about, and wounded men groaned. Manderley's forces took stock of their losses, which were not insignificant, but the prize was clear: 2 Ironborn ships captured, with survivors who might be coerced into talking. Jon prayed that at least one of them knew where Heliopike was hiding. Lord Manderley, panting and splattered with blood, approached Jon amid the chaos. "We have them," he wheezed. "Those who survived have been bound. We'll sort them out, see which might speak." His eyes gleamed with grim satisfaction. "Well done, my lord." Jon nodded, scanning the wreckage. "We can't celebrate yet. One ship escaped." Manderley spat over the side, watching his saliva vanish into the dark water. "They'll run back to her, no doubt. But at least we have a chance to pry information from these dogs." After securing the captives, the victorious ships limped back to White Harbor under torchlight. The mood was somber rather than triumphant. Men tended to the wounded, and the dead were placed aside for a proper burial. Jon felt the toll of battle weigh heavily. He had seen too much death already. Yet if this was the price to defend innocent lives, he would pay it. They arrived at White Harbor before dawn. The battered ships were towed into the docks, and exhausted men staggered onto dry land. Several prisoners were carted off to the dungeons beneath Merman's court. Jon and Manderley agreed to rest briefly, then begin interrogations at first light. In the watery glow of a new morning, Jon joined Manderley in a cold, torchlit chamber deep beneath the keep. The smell of mildew clung to the stones. 2 Ironborn prisoners knelt on the floor, hands tied behind their backs, guarded by Manderley knights. One had a bruised, swollen face, the other bore a deep cut across his arm. Their eyes seethed with defiance. "Tell us about Heliopike," Manderley demanded. "Where is she based? How many ships does she command?" The man with the swollen face spat on the floor. "You'll get no words from me, fat fish." Manderley's expression darkened, but Jon held up a hand to stay him. "If you choose silence, that's your business," Jon said quietly, stepping forward. "But know this, every day you refuse to speak, your wounded men will go untended. And if you don't care about them, maybe you care about your own life. You're in the North now. Our patience is thin for murderers." The prisoner glared but said nothing. Jon nodded to one of the guards, who produced a small dagger and began to peel back the captive's armor. The Ironborn's eyes flickered with fear for a moment. The second prisoner, the one with the arm wound, winced as he spoke up. "This is folly. She'll kill us if we betray her." "She'll kill you anyway," Manderley snapped. "Speak now, and maybe you'll leave with your life." The wounded Ironborn swallowed hard, sweat beading on his brow. All right. I'll tell you what I know. She sails out of Orkmont most often. Keeps hidden in the coves near the old ruins, says the drowned god watches over her there. She has at least 6 ships, not 5. And more men than we do. That's all I know." Jon's gaze narrowed. "What does she plan next? Another raid?" The prisoner shook his head. "She wants to make a statement. She believes the Starks are weak. She talks of taking White Harbor itself one day, turning it into an Ironborn outpost. Mad talk, but we follow because she's fearsome, and the drowned priests say she's favored by the drowned god." Manderley exchanged a grim look with Jon. So the threat was more organized than they hoped. If Helia truly had 6 ships and a fanatical following, White Harbor might be in real danger. A direct attack would still be a gamble for her, but desperation or zealotry could drive men to attempt the impossible. Jon turned back to the prisoner. "If that's all, you're done here. We'll see about your fate later." As the guards dragged the men away, Jon and Manderley stood in the dank corridor, the torchlight flickering on their tired faces. Manderley let out a heavy sigh. "Orkmont is in the heart of the Iron Islands. If we go there, we risk open war with House Greyjoy, assuming there's even a legitimate House Greyjoy left to fight." Jon nodded. "We should contact the Crown again, let them know the scale of this threat. As for me, I need to return to Winterfell, speak with Sansa. We'll decide our next move together." Manderley clasped his shoulder. "White Harbor stands with you. If the Ironborn come in force, we'll hold as long as we can. But we'll need your help and that of the realm if it escalates." Jon's voice was resolute. "You'll have it. The North is no stranger to defending itself. I'll personally ensure we're ready for whatever comes." He departed soon after, his mind churning with the complexities ahead. If Helia Pike was determined to carve out an Ironborn legacy along the northern coast, hundreds of innocent lives were at risk. The prospect of leading a campaign to the Iron Islands was daunting, reminiscent of past wars that had torn Westeros apart. Yet letting the threat fester could result in an even bloodier conflict down the line. Jon rode back to Winterfell with a sense of urgency. He yearned to see Sansa and Lyanna again, to hold them and remind himself what he was fighting for. But he also knew that time was short. The Ironborn seldom gave their enemies the courtesy of delay, and the North had to make a swift decision about how to respond. Upon returning to Winterfell under a gray sky, Jon found Sansa waiting in the courtyard, Lyanna perched on her hip. Sansa's face lit with relief as Jon dismounted. He reached them in a few strides, pressing a kiss to Sansa's cheek, then lightly ruffling Lyanna's hair. The child grinned, babbling excitedly in half-formed words. "You're safe," Sansa breathed, exhaling tension she'd clearly been holding. "What happened?" Jon explained everything in a low voice, guiding her into the warmth of the Great Hall. The noise of bustling servants faded as they slipped into a side chamber for privacy. He told her of the battle at sea, the captured Ironborn, and the new intelligence on Helia Pike. Sansa's expression grew more somber with each passing detail. "She's based in Orkmont? That's practically central in the Iron Islands," Sansa said, handing Lyanna to her nursemaid when the toddler began to fuss. "If she's got the priests behind her, this won't be an isolated band of raiders. It's closer to a religious war." Jon nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Manderley wants us to preempt her. But that would mean sailing into the Iron Islands. We'll need more than a handful of ships for that." Sansa paced, her skirts rustling on the stone floor. "We might ask the Crown for a fleet, but they might hesitate. War is costly, and the new king wants to rebuild. Unless we can prove Helia is a threat to the entire realm, not just the North, they may drag their feet." Jon set his jaw. "She's a threat to any merchant ship plying the eastern sea routes. That should be enough. But we can't wait for them to debate in King's Landing." She paused, looking at him with determination. "We could negotiate with Yara Greyjoy if she's still in power, or her allies. If we can get them to move against Helia from within the islands, it might save us an all-out invasion." Jon's eyes flickered with cautious hope. assuming Yara is still in control or at least has enough loyal men to challenge Helia. It's worth trying. We can send an envoy, a trusted one. But it's a perilous mission. Sansa folded her arms. Yes, it is. It might be our best chance at containing Helia without plunging into a full-scale war. If Yara stands aside or is powerless, then we'll have to act on our own. Either way, we need an answer fast. Jon took a steadying breath. Agreed. Who do we send? She thought for a moment. You, Arya, and I are too valuable to risk, and none of us have naval expertise. Maybe we ask Davos Seaworth to help, but he's in the south. Gendry Baratheon has had dealings with the Iron Islands before, but I'm not sure if he's the right man for a diplomatic mission. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. Maester Wolkan entered, a raven scroll in hand. Pardon, my lord, my lady. A message arrived from the crown. The king requests an update on the Ironborn raids and hints they might negotiate sending a fleet. But it's conditional on the North contributing men should war break out in the Riverlands next year. Jon let out a low hiss of frustration. They're bargaining with us as usual. Sansa's eyes glinted with determination. We might have no choice but to accept. If that's what it takes to secure naval support, we may have to yield on that front. But let's not give in just yet. We can send an envoy to King's Landing as well, pushing them to see the urgency. Jon nodded. We'll weigh all our options. For now, let's formalize the plan, attempt contact with Yara Greyjoy, warn the crown again. If neither yields results, we prepare for a direct confrontation. Sansa agreed, her posture regal despite the grim circumstances. They parted to draft letters, each step feeling heavier. The illusions of lasting peace were fading, replaced by the demands of survival and the reality that old scars seldom heal cleanly in Westeros. Days turned into weeks as the North braced itself. Letters flew to Pike and to King's Landing, each carrying urgent pleas. Patrols along the coast intensified, and at Winterfell, the forges worked day and night, smithing weapons and reinforcing armor. Jon and Sansa knew well the cost of war, but they also knew that hesitation could be just as deadly. Finally, one chilly morning, a lone ship bearing the Greyjoy Kraken approached the harbor at White Harbor under a white flag. It was not Helia's, but a vessel that claimed loyalty to Yara Greyjoy. Word reached Winterfell with astonishing speed. The letter read that a representative of Yara wished to speak with the North's leaders, possibly to broker a solution. Jon and Sansa exchanged a guarded look. Was this a trap or a genuine overture of peace? Thus, a new chapter opened, one fraught with the perils of old grudges and new ambitions. The future of the North, its fragile unity, and the safety of its shores hung in the balance. Yet as always, Jon Snow and Sansa Stark stood at the helm, bound by loyalty and love. Their decisions would shape the destiny of their people. And so they prepared themselves once more for a test of wit, will, and valor, determined that no matter the cost, they would shield the North from the storm gathering on the horizon.